fan of the look and feel of film cameras. That's why when I saw the Nikon ZF for the first time, I was immediately interested. It reminded me of my Nikon F3, which is a film-style SLR camera. However, as soon as I picked up the ZF, I noticed it had a flippy screen. And flippy screens nowadays are synonymous with hybrid functionality, which is confusing because the ZF clearly is modeled as a photocentric camera. So, did Nikon make a stills camera with a few video features? Or have they actually created a true hybrid workhorse? About a month ago, I took a trip to New York City for 5 days, and the main goal of that trip was really to do some street photography on film. But I had enough room in my backpack to pack a digital camera. Now, typically in this situation, I'd pack my Fujifilm X-H2S, which is a proven hybrid camera that I've used on many travel trips. But at this time, I was actually using the ZF and slowly replacing the X-H2S, at least when it came to stills. I hadn't explored the video functionality of the ZF at all, and taking a quick look at the specs, I realized that I could probably take it with me and make the same quality videos as I typically would. So I packed the ZF in my bag with a couple of lenses and I was off to New York. Even though I had packed the ZF in my bag, I was still skeptical about how well it would perform as a hybrid camera. And a lot of that had to do with the design of the camera. So let's get into the design. The ZF is designed after Nikon's film style of SLR cameras, but compared to more modern-day mirrorless cameras, the body is a little bit thinner and a little bit wider than what you'd be used to. It's got tactile buttons for shutter speed and ISO, and it also has a more traditional command dials if you want to use that. The camera balances really well in the hand as long as you've got the special edition lenses that feel like they're really meant to be on this camera. And these are the lenses that I took with me on my trip. They're the 40mm f2 lens and the 28mm f2.8. Due to its design, the ZF is almost impossible to use with one hand unless you add some accessories. Personally, I added a rear thumb grip, and that accessory alone completely changed the ergonomics of this camera and allowed me to use it with one hand. Once I added a front grip to the camera, that basically improved the ergonomics to make it feel very similar to a modern-day mirrorless camera. I like this approach because it basically allows me to dress up and dress down this camera based on my use. If I'm using it for an extended period of time, like on wedding days, I'll put all the accessories on to make it as comfortable as possible. But for this trip, I really just had the rear thumb grip on and wanted to go pretty minimal. The flippy screen is actually pretty good. It worked flawlessly for me. It's big, it's bright, I had absolutely no issues seeing any information. The battery was amazing even when it came to video recording. I would take 2 batteries with me out for the day and they would last me the entire day. I'd have one in the camera, one in my bag, and by the end of the day I basically used up both. I had no overheating issues even though the weather in New York was absolutely awful. It was 35 degrees and extremely humid the whole time I was there. I didn't even get one overheating warning, but the back screen did get a little bit warm. That's really about it. As you can see from the design of this camera, there's quite a few trade-offs being made, and they all seem to be made towards the photography side of things. So I was curious, would these trade-offs actually affect the video quality that this camera put out? I shot all my footage on this camera at 4K 24 FPS in N-Log. The camera records 420 10-bit internally. Now, I shot everything in N-Log because I like video editing, and N-Log gives me the most control over my files. Compared to my X-H2S, the ZF doesn't really hold up well as a video camera. The X-H2S allows me to record open gate, it's got 422 color, and it records 4K 60 with no crop. Out of these things, the only feature that I really missed was the open gate recording. That would have been nice to like recompose my videos later, and just gives you a lot more flexibility. But I was still able to make it work. Honestly, if you're doing professional video work, this camera doesn't really have the creature comforts that you'd want, and it's a little limited in that sense. So I wouldn't look to the ZF for professional video work. I had to get used to a whole new way of setting my exposure in video with the Nikon ZF. When it came to my Fujifilm X-H2S, what I would do is I'd look at the screen, check for zebras to make sure my highlights aren't clipping, and set my exposure using the exposure reading. But the Nikon ZF doesn't have an exposure reading. So I had to learn how to use waveforms. This wasn't very difficult. I just watched a couple of YouTube videos and I was able to pick it up quickly. The trouble came with the screen of this camera. If you try to use the screen to set exposure, it's very difficult because the image looks very washed out and muddy, and it's really hard to tell what your final product is going to look like. Which is why I had to rely on the waveform. So I set two display modes. The first one was the waveform in the largest possible size, and I would use that to set my exposure, and then I'd switch over to another display mode which would allow me to compose my shot before I started recording. When it comes to composition, there's a feature in the ZF that I really love, and it basically allows you to set your grid size to different aspect ratios. So I love recording in 4:3, so I set my grid type to 4:3, which allowed me to set my composition way easier on the screen. With the XH2S, this option didn't even exist, so I was constantly guessing my composition, which is definitely not a fun experience. One feature which can indirectly affect your video quality is the autofocus system. And the Nikon ZF has an amazing autofocus system. I already knew this from taking photos with this camera, but I was pleasantly surprised at how well it translated from photo to video. When it came to talking head, it tracked my eyes flawlessly, and out on the street, subject tracking was great. Honestly, the ZF's autofocus is leagues ahead of anything Fuji offers. It was such a pleasure using it, and it just allowed me to focus more on composition and making sure that I could capture the scenes in front of me. Instead of just talking about it, I figured I'd share some sample photos and videos that I took with the ZF during my time in New York City. Just editing this video and I realized I left out a pretty important technical aspect of this camera, and that is rolling shutter. So I didn't really notice rolling shutter in any of my shots until I got to a clip of me recording the subway trains. I'll throw the clip up now, but basically, as you can see, as the train goes by, there's pretty bad rolling shutter. So if that's something that is important to you or a deal breaker, you might want to pass up on the Nikon ZF. Even though the ZF had amazing video quality, it didn't really address the fears that I had regarding its hybrid functionality. So what makes a great hybrid camera? For me, it's excellent photo and video quality, and most importantly, the camera has to quickly and seamlessly be able to switch between photo and video modes. And that is where I think the Nikon ZF falls short. So before I can get into that, I need to talk a little bit about how I like to use the ZF in both photo and video modes. Starting with photo mode, I like to have as close to an analog experience as possible. So what that means with the ZF is the back screen is closed. I'm exclusively using the viewfinder, and I'm setting my exposure in manual mode using the shutter speed dial, the ISO dial, and ideally an aperture ring. Unfortunately, None of the Z lenses really have aperture rings, which I think is a big miss by Nikon. So instead, I have to use the rear command dial to set the aperture. In an ideal world, I would just be able to use the exact same control scheme when it came to video settings. Unfortunately, I can't, and I have to default to using the front and rear command dials, and that is my first big issue with the Nikon ZF. Instead of using the shutter speed dial to set my exposure, I'm forced to put it in custom mode and then use the front command dial. So there's a switch right under the shutter speed dial, and it quickly allows you to swap between the two modes. Typically, most hybrid cameras have completely different exposure memories for photo and video modes. And the Nikon ZF does as well, unless you're using the analog dials on top of the camera. So when you swap from photo to video mode, you have to set the analog dials on top of the camera to their custom settings in order to access your previous exposure settings that you had in your video mode. This is just an added step that isn't really necessary and can slow you down and cause you to miss capturing moments. It actually compounds because when you swap from video mode to photo, you have to set your exposure all over again if you were using the top dials. There's already a solution in the camera to this, and it's to always be using the front and rear command dials when you're setting exposure in both photo and video modes. But I don't think that's a good solution because the whole reason why I got the ZF is to use the analog dials. This could honestly be fixed by a simple firmware update that maybe allows you to override the command dials in video mode. Either way, it was definitely a nuisance and added a bunch of extra steps during the whole process that absolutely weren't necessary. Another weird issue is that the shutter speed dial doesn't have the option to set 1/50th of a second, and that would have been really useful for anyone who's recording at 24 FPS like me. So you're almost forced into setting the shutter speed dial to its custom mode when it comes to recording video. The other point of friction that I had with the camera was the view modes. The default settings for the view mode are to display your image on the monitor. And if the camera detects that you've brought it up to your eye, it will switch the image to your viewfinder. The problem here is that the view mode settings are global. These settings are great when I'm in photo mode, but when I'm in video mode, it can get in my way. When I'm recording video, I'm using the monitor exclusively, so if I bring the camera close to my body, it basically thinks that I'm bringing the camera up to my eye. So it switches the display from the monitor to the viewfinder, causing my screen to go black, and I basically am blind, so I have to do this weird dance where I'm moving the camera further away to get my display back, and it just generally messes up my recording. This is another super easy fix. If they just made view mode settings specific to photo and video mode, it would just solve the problem. Overall, I think both of these issues didn't really affect my video quality or stop me from capturing something, but they definitely slowed me down. The good news is that they can be fixed by simple firmware updates, and I think these small key fixes could highly improve the usability of this camera. So, did the Nikon ZF live up to my expectations? Is it a true hybrid camera? I'd say yeah, it is, and it absolutely did live up to my expectations. It probably exceeded them. I mean, it gave me the analog photography experience I was looking for with modern day autofocus, as well as the hybrid functionality we're all used to with mirrorless cameras. All of that in a tiny package at a great price. There's clearly compromises being made here, but luckily for me, they're all on the video side of things, as this is a photography-centric camera. But in spite of all that, it performs wonderfully as a hybrid camera. And I'm going to continue using this as my primary photo camera, but now I'll probably end up using it as my primary hybrid camera as well. I hope you all enjoyed my thoughts on the Nikon ZF as a hybrid camera. I've been thinking about doing a full-on review, especially of its photo capabilities. So if you're interested in that, drop that in the comments below, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.